BioCarnage was my capstone for UCF, and it is a third-person shooter that is built in the Unreal Engine. I was also the team's only level designer, so I designed, concept, and gray box every area within the game. And when I was brought onto the team, I was tasked with first creating a prototype, which you see right here. And I designed this with some popular games of mine like Halo and Unreal Tournament. And I designed this level for the prototype to be an arena similar to those two games I just mentioned. So I designed it to be very close quarters, some verticality to give the player some range of movement, get used to the controls, and get used to some combat. And you can see here, this was the final result of the prototype that allowed us to continue to make the full game. After that happened, I went on to design the desert level in its entirety. Now, I knew from the get-go that it was going to be a linear experience, but I also wanted to give the player a sense of freedom so that way they know they're not just on one strict path. They had some room to maneuver and explore and hopefully have some fun. So the goal of the desert level was essentially to introduce the player mechanics and combat, as well as hopefully give the player a sense of freedom and being powerful, like they can just mow through all the enemies that you find here. But again, I wanted to ensure that the player had the option to choose their own path. So the way that I went about this, I tried to create 3 different primary paths. The one on the left was basically for our players who are already familiar with how to move about in the game, whereas the middle one was for our players who liked the combat and just wanted to get into the thick of it. And then finally, the one on the right, the light combat path, was basically our scenic route. This is where you would still have to fight some enemies, but they're fairly small and very easy to get through, and it gives you a nice view of the entire section. After we were done with the desert level, I then went into the metro, where the design for this one was very different from the desert. For one, it was obviously in an interior environment, and it by its nature was modular in design. For this particular level, I heavily relied on 2D maps. So I did a bunch of sketches, I laid them down, and I put them into Photoshop and presented it to my team for approval that you can see here. And once everybody was on board and I was ready to get into the engine, I started implementing my layouts directly into the engine, as you can see here, and then I started constructing the environment around it, like you can see in this first block out. And then afterwards, when the entire block out was made, I then started to focus on lighting, because I knew in this particular level I wanted to contrast with the desert level very starkly, whereas in the desert level I wanted you to feel open and free. In the subway, I wanted you to feel confined and maybe a little even creeped out by the environment. So I made everything really dark and as dingy and as broken as possible. And after the metro level, we get into ground zero. This is very different from the other 2 areas where this is more open, but it's also underground. And this also gave me the opportunity to explore the aliens' culture. So in Ground Zero, the goal was to defeat the final boss, but in order to get to it, you have to shut down the power to the surrounding bases. In this case, there were 4, and each base has a different theme. The first one was essentially the alien temple, where they worship the alien boss as kind of like their deity. The second area is basically the metamorph birthing chamber, which is the enemy that was introduced in the ending of the metro that you can see right here. And this happens to be one of my favorite locations because I took some design inspirations from the film 1984. So I wanted to try to emulate that by creating a large screen that the metamorph would stare into. I made the walls, for example, highly reflective, so that way the metamorph, which used to be humans, can see how they've been mutilated, and there's no option for them to go back to their humanity, so they just become servants of the aliens. And for the next area is basically the alien hangar. This one is fairly straightforward. I just wanted to show how the aliens are actually mobilized. They are organized, they are efficient, they are powerful, and they have a lot of firepower behind it. And then this last base here is essentially what I call the recycling center. And this is where essentially all of the aliens that have been defeated are sent to basically be broken down and become food for the elder boss.